The village of Valdeoro rested quietly between rolling hills and endless fields of sun-colored wheat in the south of Spain. From far away, it looked as though time had forgotten it completely. Narrow cobblestone streets curved between white houses with red clay roofs, and every evening the bell of the old church echoed softly across the valley. Life in Valdeoro moved slowly. Farmers left their homes before sunrise and walked toward the fields with tools resting on their shoulders. By mid-morning, the small bakery in the town square filled the air with the smell of warm bread and cinnamon. Children ran through dusty paths after school, while their parents talked beneath ancient olive trees that had stood there for centuries. Nothing extraordinary ever seemed to happen there. Among the oldest residents of the village was a woman named Rosa Alvarez. She was 73 years old and had lived in the same small stone house near the edge of town for more than 50 years. Her husband, Mateo, had passed away long ago, leaving the house and its small garden entirely to her. The garden was Rosa's favorite place. Behind the house stood a low white wall covered in climbing ivy. Inside were a few olive trees, several clay pots filled with lavender and rosemary, and a wooden bench Mateo had built decades earlier. In the center of the garden stood a small statue of the Virgin Mary. The statue was simple, carved from pale stone and barely taller than Rosa's waist. Mateo had bought it many years before during a visit to a monastery in the nearby mountains. Rosa still remembered the day he brought it home. He had carried it through the garden carefully, smiling like a man bringing something precious. "Every home needs a little peace," he had said as he placed the statue among the flowers. For many years the statue simply stood there. Rain washed over its smooth surface during winter storms. Summer sunlight slowly faded its colors. Sometimes neighborhood children played near the garden wall while Rosa watered her plants and told them stories. Other evenings, she sat quietly on the bench beside the statue, watching the sun disappear behind the distant hills. It was simply part of the garden. Or at least, that was what everyone believed. Everything began to change in the summer of 2024. That year, Rosa's granddaughter Elena, who was only 6 years old, came to stay with her while Elena's parents traveled for work. The little girl arrived carrying a small suitcase, a bright blue backpack, and a stuffed rabbit she refused to leave behind. Elena was curious about everything. She followed Rosa through the garden, each morning asking questions about the flowers, the trees, and the old wooden bench. But the thing that fascinated her most was the statue. "Who is she?" Elena asked on the first day. "That is the Virgin Mary," Rosa said gently. Elena looked up at the stone face for a long moment. She looked sad. Rosa smiled softly. "Maybe she's just thinking." The girl began spending a lot of time near the statue. Sometimes she sat beside it drawing pictures in a small notebook. Other times, she simply watched the quiet stone figure as if she expected it to move. One evening in late July, just before sunset, Elena was sitting alone in the garden while Rosa prepared dinner inside the house. The sky above Valdeoro glowed orange and pink. Warm wind moved softly through the olive branches, and the distant church bell echoed across the valley. Elena looked toward the statue. For a long moment, she stared silently. Then she whispered softly, "Why are you crying?" A few minutes later, Rosa stepped outside to call her for dinner. Elena was still sitting in the same place. "What are you doing, Querida?" Rosa asked. The girl pointed toward the statue. "Grandma, the lady is sad." Rosa walked closer and looked carefully at the stone face. Everything appeared normal. The statue stood exactly as it always had, its expression calm and peaceful in the fading light. "There's nothing there," Rosa said gently. Elena frowned. There was water on her face. Rosa touched the statue with her hand. The stone felt completely dry. "It was probably rain from yesterday," she said calmly. Elena didn't argue. But as they walked back into the house, the little girl turned once more to look at the statue, standing quietly among the lavender flowers. That night a violent storm passed over Valdeoro. Thunder rolled across the hills and rain fell for hours against the stone walls of the houses. The next morning Rosa stepped outside early to check on her garden. She carried a watering can and walked slowly toward the statue. Then she stopped. Something about it looked different. At first she thought it was only the reflection of the morning sunlight. But as she moved closer, she saw two thin lines running down the statue's cheeks. Exactly where tears would fall. Rosa slowly touched the stone. The surface was wet, yet the rest of the statue remained completely dry. She stood there in silence for several seconds. Behind her, Elena walked quietly into the garden. The little girl looked up at the statue again. "I told you," she said softly. Rosa felt a strange chill move through her, because at that moment she realized something had begun that she could not explain. And soon the quiet village of Valdeoro would learn about it. At first, Rosa told no one. She tried to convince herself there had to be a simple explanation. The statue had stood in that garden for more than 30 years. Rain had fallen on it hundreds of times. Summer heat had cracked the soil around it again and again. Never once had anything strange happened. Yet the thin lines on the statue's face had been real. She had seen them clearly, and she had felt the cold moisture on the stone. That morning, Rosa wiped the statue's face gently with the corner of her apron. The stone beneath her fingers felt smooth and cool. But by the afternoon, the same lines appeared again. Elena noticed them immediately. "Grandma," she said quietly while standing near the flower bed. "She's crying again." Rosa turned slowly. Two tiny droplets were forming beneath the statue's eyes. They moved slowly down the pale stone surface. Exactly like tears. A strange knot tightened in Rosa's stomach. That afternoon, a neighbor named Don Mateo Ruiz stopped by to return a basket Rosa had lent him earlier in the week. Mateo was an elderly farmer who lived 2 houses away and spent most of his days working in the olive groves outside the village. As they spoke near the garden wall, Elena suddenly ran toward them. "Grandma, look." She pointed toward the statue. Mateo laughed softly. "What is it now, little one?" "The lady is crying," Elena said. Mateo smiled, as if expecting a childish imagination. But Elena grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the garden. Rosa followed behind them slowly. The afternoon sunlight filled the yard with warm golden light. For a moment, everything looked perfectly normal. Then Mateo leaned closer to the statue. His smile slowly faded. "Well, that's strange," he murmured. Rosa felt her heart begin to beat faster. Mateo pointed toward the statue's face. 2 thin streaks of moisture were sliding down the stone cheeks. He carefully touched the statue with one finger. "It's wet," he said quietly. "But the rest of the statue is dry." For several seconds, none of them spoke. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. Elena looked proudly at her grandmother. "See," she said. Mateo slowly stepped back and crossed himself. "I don't understand this," he whispered. That evening, Mateo told his wife. His wife told her sister. And by the next morning, nearly everyone in Valdeoro had heard the story. At first, the neighbors came only out of curiosity. 2 women from the bakery stopped by on their way home from work. A group of teenagers arrived after school, whispering and laughing while pushing open the small garden gate. Most of them expected to see nothing unusual, but several of them saw the same thing. Small droplets forming beneath the statue's eyes. The news spread quickly through the village. Within 3 days, people from nearby towns began arriving as well. Some came carrying flowers. Others brought candles. A few simply stood quietly in the garden staring at the statue with disbelief. Rosa never invited anyone, and she never asked for money. "I don't know what it means," she told people honestly. "I'm just as confused as you are." Elena often sat quietly on the wooden bench beside the statue while visitors came and went. Sometimes she whispered softly toward the stone figure. One afternoon, Rosa finally asked her about it. "What do you say to her?" she asked gently. Elena shrugged. "She listens." "Listens to what?" "To people." The word stayed in Rosa's mind long after the conversation ended. Then, one Sunday afternoon, something happened that changed everything. A woman named Lucia Navarro arrived from a town almost 50 kilometers away. She was 54 years old and had been fighting a serious illness for nearly 2 years. Her sister had heard about the statue and convinced her to come. Lucia walked slowly into Rosa's garden. Her hands trembled as she knelt in front of the statue. For several minutes, she prayed silently. The small crowd that had gathered watched in complete silence. Then Lucia suddenly lifted her head. Her eyes were wide. "The tears," she whispered. "They're warm." Several people stepped closer. Rosa felt her heart racing. Thin droplets were forming again beneath the statue's eyes. Lucia carefully placed her fingers beneath one of them. She stared at the moisture in her hand. "It's warm," she repeated softly. Someone in the crowd pulled out a phone and began recording. Within hours, the video began spreading across social media. Within 2 days, reporters from nearby cities started calling Rosa. Within a week, people from all across Spain were traveling to Valdeoro. The quiet garden that had once belonged only to Rosa and Elena began filling with strangers every day. Some believed they were witnessing a miracle. Others insisted there had to be a scientific explanation. But everyone wanted to see the statue, and the peaceful life of Valdeoro was about to change forever. Within 2 weeks, the quiet village of Valdeoro was no longer the peaceful place it had always been. Cars began arriving before sunrise. By mid-morning, the narrow road leading to Rosa's house was filled with visitors. Some came from nearby cities like Granada and Córdoba. Others traveled from far across Spain after hearing about the strange statue on television or seeing the video online. News vans parked near the village square. Reporters stood in front of cameras describing what people had started calling the Weeping Virgin of Valdeoro. Rosa watched all of this with growing unease. Her garden had always been a quiet place, a small piece of peace where she watered flowers and remembered her husband. Now strangers walked through it every day, whispering, praying, and pointing cameras toward the statue. But Rosa never turned anyone away. People came for many different reasons. Some arrived simply curious, but many came carrying heavy worries in their hearts. A young couple brought a photograph of their missing son. An elderly man with trembling hands asked Rosa if he could pray for his failing heart. A mother carried a small child who had never spoken since birth. Each person knelt before the statue. Each whispered their hopes into the warm summer air. Sometimes nothing happened, but occasionally visitors claimed something unusual. One afternoon, a man from Valencia said the pain in his injured knee suddenly disappeared after touching the stone base of the statue. Another woman said the terrible headaches she had suffered for years stopped the moment she prayed in the garden. Stories like these spread quickly. For some people, the statue became a symbol of hope. For others, it became a mystery that demanded explanation. Soon, scientists arrived. A small research team from a university in Madrid asked Rosa for permission to examine the statue. They brought cameras, moisture sensors, and equipment designed to detect hidden sources of water or chemicals that might explain the tears. Rosa agreed. "I want to understand it too," she told them. For 2 days, the researchers studied the statue carefully. They examined every part of the stone. They searched for hidden cracks where water might collect. They measured humidity levels in the air. They even collected a microscopic sample from the statue's surface. The results confused them. There was no hidden reservoir of water inside the statue. No pipes. No chemicals. No evidence that anyone had altered the stone. Yet the droplets continued to appear. The scientists eventually gave a cautious answer. "There may be a natural cause we simply have not discovered yet," one researcher told reporters outside the garden. But they could not prove it. The investigation only increased the attention surrounding the village. Within a month, hundreds of visitors were arriving each week. The local church decided to help manage the crowds. A small wooden barrier was placed around the statue to protect the garden, and volunteers guided visitors through the narrow paths between the flower beds. Flowers began appearing everywhere. Candles flickered along the garden wall at night. Some people left handwritten prayers beside the roses. Through all of this, Elena remained the calmest person in the village. She still spent hours sitting quietly on the wooden bench beside the statue. Sometimes she whispered softly, as if speaking to someone only she could hear. One evening, Rosa finally asked the question that had been on her mind for weeks. "What do you talk about with her?" she asked gently. Elena thought for a moment. "She listens." "Listens to what?" "To people." Rosa frowned slightly. "What people?" Elena looked toward the statue, glowing softly in the golden light of sunset. "All of them," she said quietly. Rosa felt a chill move down her spine. "What else does she say?" Elena hesitated. Then she shrugged. "She says people are very sad." The word stayed in Rosa's mind long after the conversation ended. Meanwhile, the debate surrounding the statue continued to grow. Some priests believed the tears were a sign of compassion. Others warned people not to jump to conclusions. Skeptics insisted the entire event was nothing more than condensation mixed with imagination. But one fact remained impossible to deny. The statue continued to cry. Not constantly, not every day, but often enough that hundreds of people had now seen the small droplets forming beneath the stone eyes. And no one, not scientists, reporters, priests, or skeptics, could explain why. Yet the most remarkable moment had not happened yet. Because soon something would occur in Rosa's small garden that would leave even the most doubtful visitors completely silent. By early autumn, the story of the statue had spread far beyond Spain. Visitors began arriving from other countries. Some carried rosaries and Bibles. Others came with cameras and notebooks, determined to document every detail of what people were calling the mystery of Valdeoro. Yet despite the growing attention, Rosa had tried to keep her life simple. Every morning, she watered the flowers in her garden. Every afternoon, she baked bread or prepared small meals while Elena played nearby. And every evening, as the sun lowered behind the hills, the two of them often sat quietly on the wooden bench beside the statue. The crowds had slowly become part of daily life. But one evening in late September, something happened that no one expected. That day had been especially busy. Nearly 100 visitors had walked through the garden, leaving flowers, candles, and small handwritten prayers near the statue. Some people cried quietly as they prayed. Others simply stared at the stone face, hoping to witness the mysterious tears for themselves. By sunset, most of the visitors had gone home. Only a small group remained. The air was warm and calm. A gentle wind moved through the olive trees, carrying the distant sound of the church bell across the valley. Elena sat on the bench, swinging her feet slowly, while Rosa spoke quietly with a woman who had traveled from Madrid. Then suddenly Elena stood up. She walked slowly toward the statue. "Grandma," she said softly. Rosa turned. Elena was staring up at the statue again. Several of the remaining visitors noticed and stepped closer. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The statue stood peacefully among the lavender and roses. Then someone gasped. 2 clear drops of moisture appeared beneath the statue's eyes. The tears moved slowly down the stone cheeks, just as they had many times before. But this moment felt different. The entire garden fell silent. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. Elena stepped closer to the statue and looked up at its face with calm curiosity. Then she spoke quietly. "It's okay." Rosa frowned slightly. "What do you mean, Querida?" Elena did not turn around. "She says people heard her." The visitors exchanged confused glances. Rosa walked slowly toward the girl. "Heard what?" she asked. Elena finally turned to look at her grandmother. "She says people remember now." No one spoke. The only sound was the soft rustling of olive leaves in the evening breeze. The last droplet slid slowly down the statue's face. And then something remarkable happened. The tears stopped. Completely. Days passed. Then weeks. Visitors continued arriving, hoping to see the statue cry again. But the stone face remained dry. Scientists returned once more to examine it. They still found nothing unusual. Gradually, the reporters stopped visiting. The crowds became smaller. Eventually, the garden returned to the quiet, peaceful place it had once been. Yet something had clearly changed in Valdeoro. Many people who had visited Rosa's home said the experience had altered the way they saw the world. Some began helping their neighbors more often. Some returned to faith they had abandoned years earlier. Others simply said the strange story reminded them that kindness still mattered. Rosa never claimed to understand what had truly happened. Whenever someone asked if she believed it had been a miracle, she always gave the same answer. "I don't know," she would say gently. "But I do know one thing." She would look toward the statue, standing quietly among the roses. For a little while, people stopped and listened. Elena still spent time sitting beside the statue in the evenings. Sometimes Rosa asked if the lady still spoke to her. Elena would simply smile and shake her head. "She doesn't need to anymore," the girl said once. And in the quiet garden at the edge of Valdeoro, the statue of the Virgin Mary stood peacefully once again. But the story of the summer when it cried would never completely disappear. Because hundreds of people had seen the tears, and every one of them left that small garden believing something different about hope.